All right, we're here in New York City with Dan Laby, a professor and ophthalmologist who's been focused on sports vision training for a very significant portion of his career, and we'll be talking all about how sports vision training can benefit athletes and how Reflexion fits into that picture. Dan, so we're familiar with your work, of course, but for those at home who are less familiar, could you give them a bit of an overview?
Sure. So I've been in the area of sports vision for pretty much all of my eye care life. It's been close to a little over 30 years. Since I started at UCLA when I was doing my fellowship, we started a project with the Los Angeles Dodgers, and it's sort of mushroomed and grown from there, from being kind of a small component of something, a research project I did on the side, to now pretty much what I do most of my day.
So why here?
Here in New York? Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. The simple answer is I was born in New York. Although I lived away from New York for many decades, my kids came back to New York, and I followed my kids. Now, that being the case, New York City is some call the center of the world in media, advertising, and so forth, and certainly in technology and finance and world travel. It's one of the centers on the globe, and it's a great place to be located for sports vision and sports and athletes, because almost everybody passes through New York, whatever sport they have throughout the year.
Right, and I mean, you touch on athletes, but you are an ophthalmologist. What got you focused on sports vision?
Well, my training is in pediatric ophthalmology in kids. And what's interesting, the vision of kids and the visions of athletes, not to mention that many athletes are kids or young adults, is very similar. Kids need to have good vision in both eyes so they can learn how to use both eyes together, have good depth perception, have good visual development, and so forth. And athletes are really no different. For an athlete to perform optimally in their sport, they need to have many specific visual functions, and they have to know how to use their vision in terms of making a decision and then a coordinated motor action, whether it's with the upper body, the hands, or if it's the lower body, or maybe both, to perform their sport. So there's a fair amount of overlap between pediatric ophthalmology, where I started my training at UCLA, and sports vision, more so than any other specialty in ophthalmology.
Interesting. So, I mean, there's clearly an opportunity, but what exactly got you focused? What made you bridge that gap from pediatric to...
So the initial ground set of pediatrics kind of spurred me. It was interesting in sports vision, but then it was a whole other dimension. The idea that sports vision is a new specialty. It's something that there wasn't a lot of good scientific data about how vision in athletes can interfere with or help their performance on the field or in their sport. And so the idea of being able to start was something where there wasn't a lot of knowledge, and learn as we go over the 30 years was something that really was gasoline on the fire. The pediatrics sort of started the fire, and then the idea that we could develop this specialty of sports vision and show scientific validity to performance really got the fire going.
Yeah, you touched on research. I know that you're a large advocate for quality research in the field of sports vision, and recently you and Greg Applebaum, worked on a meta-analysis of a lot of research that's out there, and you introduced, I believe, a framework for how to design these studies, or at least how to measure the effectiveness of these studies, or how good they are, essentially. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you got to the framework that you arrived at?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of trying to develop a specialty within medicine is one of the things I really devoted a good part of my 30 years experience towards. Unfortunately, there's a lot of hearsay, a lot of anecdotal information based on one or two players, information that really doesn't carry the proof that a good scientific study would. And so throughout my 30 years, we've published dozens of papers that get peer-reviewed and get accepted by established journals to kind of put them through a vetting process to make sure what we find is really actually there and true. Unfortunately, a lot of other studies have gone through that haven't met that criteria, and they're probably, I'd say, poorly designed. The results are questionable. The question is, really vision making a difference? Is it some other factors that could be causing this improved performance that the authors feel may be visually based? That interferes, that muddies the waters when the athlete's trying to understand what can they do to perform better. it also actually muddies the water for the specialty, because if people are going to rely on something, they find out later that it's not true, then that's going to make them have a negative impression about the value of vision in sports performance. And so there are several sports vision specialists, Greg Applebaum was one of them, that have the same mindset that I do, that we want to move scientifically forward in what we're doing and not work on kind of just feelings and gut emotions, or even something that someone taught us in school at one point to do this, and we just do it because that's what we were taught. A good scientist questions why we're doing it, what's the proof behind it, how's it going to work, is it going to work, what do we do? And that's the approach we've taken, and that's the paper that you mentioned with Greg that we put together, looking at the literature and seeing that the majority of the papers that were published are really poorly designed scientifically, and that the results are really quite dubious in terms of being valid or not.
So for the layperson, what are the 2 or 3 largest issues that you see in the studies that are out there? You talked about many of them being anecdotal.
Yeah. Well, that's probably the biggest thing, is they're based on a small number. When you have one player that you do something with and they have a great season the next season, it could be because of what you did, but it's most likely due to other factors. We know there's a natural variability in performance of players in any case, regardless of any vision intervention or testing. And so studies need to be powered. We use the term powered, having enough people in the study in order to really have a good chance of being representative of the entire population of athletes. One person compared to all the athletes in a sport is not a very similar group. If you have a large number, cross-section of many different levels, males and females, if that's the case, different abilities, you're going to have a much better chance to create a sample that's similar to the actual population. And if you can create that similarity, then your results in the sample can be transferred, can be thought of as applying to the general population. That's one. Number 2 is removing bias. Removing bias. Bias is something that is on almost every study. As a physician, I want my patients to get better. As a sports vision specialist, I want my athletes to perform at their best. And because of that, I'm going to look and see and find things that I do that I think are doing that for them. But that's maybe not necessarily the case. And so creating a study that we call a prospective study, where we don't know what treatment somebody's getting ahead of time, a blinded study in that case, that looks at a treatment and sees how it works down the road, where we don't know, are they getting the real treatment, getting a placebo treatment, and seeing how it works. And then if you see a difference, you can say, you know what, I didn't know who got what. This is how they performed. They both got the same thing. They didn't know what they were getting. Removing all these different confounders, these things that can influence the results, makes the study much more valid. And those are the studies that really show what's happening.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say those who are designing new studies should focus on? What's the future of sports vision research?
Well, the future is wide open, because fortunately companies like Reflexion with their devices and many other companies are constantly putting out new devices, new systems, new ways of testing that are wonderful, that weren't available 30 years ago. I remember, along with my colleague David Kirshen, having to change computer chips in what was a system available then to get it to perform the way we needed it for the athletes. Fortunately, those days are gone. We don't have to take apart systems and change computer chips and bend the pins and have to throw them away. It was a major hassle. Now we have companies that are coming up with artificial intelligence ways of doing things, coming up with virtual reality ways of doing things, with boards, touch boards like the Reflexion that, no one thought would be able to hit a screen and not worry about the screen breaking. Types of things, amazing technologies, but now we have to test them. Now we have to understand how they work. We have to understand which are the best techniques to use those systems to gain the best perspective on the vision of the athlete, and what's going to predict their performance the best. And so there's a lot of opportunity for research, if it's designed properly, can become very valuable, and we may be on the edge of the glory days, if you will, of sports vision with all these potential interventions. That
should be pretty exciting for athletes. Why should they care, in a nutshell?
Well, as we've published several papers showing that the performance and vision tests relates to performance in the sport. Any athlete who wants to perform at their best, and if they're putting in the time and effort to train on a daily basis and risking injury and so forth, and certainly have a potential of a professional career, which could be very lucrative, they're going to want to invest as well in anything they can do to perform better. You see them buying, sneakers, shoes, bats, clothing, even, Tom Brady's sleepwear to make you perform better. All these different things athletes will pick up if it proves to work. Now, for example, there were colored contact lenses that Nike had in the past a few years ago that they were being advertised. You use these lenses, you perform better, and so forth. And they kind of had a flash, and there was probably a not ideal rollout. In other words, rolled out commercially before the studies were completed, and they had all sorts of troubles. They withdrew it from the market, and it went away. So here's a flash that athletes bought them, wanted to use them. We got a lot of interest in them, but without the scientific backing to understand the benefit, the whole thing dissolved. Not to say that tinted contact lenses don't have a benefit. They actually probably do, but we need the research to show that.
It all goes back to the research at the end of the day.
Well, would you want to go to the doctor and have them give you a pill that wasn't researched and approved by the FDA?
Probably not.
Probably not. And so you need to really do the groundwork, the basic work to show that what you're proposing has merit and has value and is likely to succeed in the way you want it to before you use it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people using a lot of sports vision systems that they promote as being very beneficial without the real good data.
Now you've actually done some amount of research with Reflection. Of course, there's always more that can be done, but could you just talk a little bit about the research that you've done for our viewers?
Yeah, we anytime a new device comes out, I just got a device a couple weeks ago, a really cool device, I think, that sort of builds on something that we already knew about. Reflection came out with the Edge, and we were, I think, maybe one of the first people that were using it. Just like any hardware device, there were some growing pangs in terms of hardware. I think a lot of those pretty much all have been resolved, and the system is pretty reliable at this stage. And so we've been using it for several years, I'm going to guess probably around 5 years. And we've evolved to some extent, and that makes it a little difficult when we're trying to compare results between year to year because it's a little bit different tests. But the last few years, we've had a pretty stable program, if you will, using the system. And we're gathering the data to try to understand exactly, do what we said, make the scientific analysis, make the statistics on it to show the relationship to performance. And we did some early work on that with some of our early results, and we showed connections between that test on the Edge board and a more standard kind of older test. And we showed relationships to batting performance as well. And so,
and what sort of athletes were
yeah, so these are baseball players, professional baseball players, both minor leaguers and major leaguers that we evaluate each year at spring training.
And I think in those studies there were some interesting correlations between Reflections data and on-field performance. Could you talk about that and why those correlations are meaningful?
Yep. So a lot of times, when we're looking for on-field correlation, performance correlations, that's really the golden egg there. We want to show that a vision intervention, a vision test that we do has connection to actual performance in the sport. It's nice to be able to show someone sees better or reacts faster, but if that doesn't translate into actually performing better, there's a little bit less value to actually doing the work. So we look at trying to relate that to specific, in terms of baseball function. And when we're looking at baseball, we can look at offensive and defensive abilities, and certainly batting is going to be the key component here. When we look at batting, there's lots of metrics. Look at sabermetrics. Baseball is one of the sports that has the most amount of data that comes out from any time a batter steps in the box. But there's different kinds of data, and you want to look at the data that is the most reflective of that individual batter's ability without any influence of anyone else on the field. So something like slugging percentage or on-base percentage, batting average are metrics that are influenced by not only the batter's ability, but by the fielder's ability, frankly. Someone hits a great ball and there's a diving catch, he's out. That's not going to be great for his batting average. Whereas if that diving catch didn't happen, it was a double, that could have been, a positive event. And so that's not, if it depends on the shortstop's ability to catch the ball, that's not going to be related to the batter. And that's not going to be connected or correlated to any kind of performance they do.
Simply because what another player does has nothing to do with the batter's visual performance.
Exactly right. So we want to try to find metrics that are most isolated, dependent 100% on the batter and nobody else. Now, unfortunately, in batting, we have a pitcher, and the pitcher's ability can play a role as well. But no other player in the field has any role in something like, for example, walk rate. How frequently does a batter walk, or a strikeout rate? Or how frequently does a batter swing at pitches that are in the strike zone versus out of the strike zone? Those are things that have nothing to do with anyone else on the field except the pitcher throwing the ball in or out of the strike zone. And more importantly, the batter's ability to judge where the pitch is going to go, whether he's going to swing at it or not, and so forth. So we use things called plate discipline metrics, which are those metrics right there. And we correlated, actually, we published a paper with several hundred professional baseball players on a different test of hand-eye coordination, and showed a very strong relationship between some of those plate discipline metrics and the visual reaction time metrics. And what we wanted to do was to show whether or not the edge board could duplicate that. Now, the edge board has several other advantages over the older test. As you would expect, with progression of technology, things get better. And so we wanted to show, at least in the basic sense, the correlation between the edge board and this other system, which then translates into performance on the field. And if that's the case, then we can use the edge board not only for that task, but maybe for some other tasks that may have more correlation, and train with the edge board and so forth. The biggest advantage of the edge board obviously being its portability.
Absolutely. So I know that we saw specific correlations between things like complex reaction time to swinging strike percentage and a batter's speed and so on. Does that mean that if an athlete has better complex reaction time, that they will be better in those on-field performance metrics?
Well, we always say that correlation doesn't mean causation. And so the fact that it's correlated doesn't necessarily mean by training someone to react faster that they're going to perform better. That's sort of the next step. I look at it in a stepwise fashion. First, we have to show we have a test that is related to this on-field skill. Then the big question is, if you train that skill to be better, you're going to see better performance in the field. That research is nowhere near complete, even though there are papers, as we reviewed in that meta-analysis, that suggest that training is going to make you perform better, your team perform better. And that's another interesting thing. When you train the players and you look at the team data. Obviously, when you have team data, you're going to have a more muddy picture than looking at individual people that you're training. That's a problem. But in general, correlation first, and then we look for improvement. So I can't tell you if training is going to make it better, but I can tell you that it's related somehow. And when we looked at our data, we saw that there was, the people at the bottom that didn't have fast ability in the reaction, that they just didn't perform as well.
So if you're an athlete and you're trying to gain an edge, then you would say it might make sense for you to at least try and maybe collect your own data and see if it makes a difference for you, right? Because we know that it's related, and there's work to be done on the research side to show that causation.
Yeah, it all comes down to low hanging fruit, and where your issues are and so forth. So, if you're a 10-year-old, for example, who has a lot of probably technical issues related to their swing and their stance and their positioning, that's probably going to be the bigger factor. But if you're someone who's towards the end of high school, college, who's looking for a little more serious career, you've probably perfected most all the physical things already in your batting ability. Now we need to look at some other things that are a little more subtle, that aren't going to have as big an impact as your stance in the box and so forth. But if you perfected that, can give you a little bit more of an edge. And if you look at any of these people looking for getting the draft to get signed, I'm not going to say they're all the same, but there's a lot of similarity in a lot of them. And it gets to the point where it's really hard for the teams to know which player is going to be the next MVP of the World Series or the Rookie of the Year. It comes into a lot of data that teams are looking at to try to figure that out. And so if you can get yourself a little bit of an edge, why not? Why go in there handicapped?
Absolutely, it's a great point. And that we work at Reflection with a lot of developing athletes, going back actually to your point about the relationship between pediatric and sports vision. What do you like about Reflection for those athletes or the folks who train them?
Yeah. Reflection, the edge system is something that is, number one, portable. There's a couple different versions, as besides the ones we use in spring training, there's a kind of at-home version, I guess we call it. And there's even a recent app that may have some interest, so you don't even have to worry about having hardware. You just use your mobile device. Those sorts of options, if you will, make the edge one of the systems that is really accessible for people to use. And that accessibility opens up the ability to use it. And there's no reason why anyone, maybe not a 4-year-old, but someone who's getting into better Little League, Babe Ruth leagues and getting into high school sports and college sports, there's really no reason why they wouldn't want to at least test themselves, benchmark themselves against others, maybe see an option, an area, opportunity where they can do some training to improve, see that improvement. And although I don't have the actual scientific data, logically speaking, there's a understanding that if you do better here, you'll be better on the field. For example, having a fast reaction time doesn't mean you're gonna swing at more pitches, you're gonna move the bat faster. What it really means, it seems like from the data, is that it gives you the option to sit back a little bit more, to see a little bit more of the pitch, to make a little bit better decision. Is this ball your ball you want to hit, or are you going to let it go? And so we see people that have these fast reaction times actually allow more strikes. They don't swing as many strikes. They kind of wait for their pitch that they want to hit. Now they don't strike out. In fact, they walk more frequently. So they don't wait too long, right? They're not going to let 3 strikes go by. But they're, if they have a little bit of count in their favor, and this pitch isn't exactly where they think they want to hit it, well, we'll take the strike, and then we'll look at the next pitch.
It's more of a patient approach.
It's called discipline. They call it plate discipline for a reason, right? And people that have good plate discipline tend to perform better batting than the people that go up there and just swing at what they think they want to, quickly at everything, and that's it. Those are people that are not going to be as productive.
Is that in some ways related to the quiet eye? I know that you talk about that.
Quiet eye is a little bit different. Quiet eye is once you've made the decision to actually swing, keeping your eye at a certain point to pick up the information. Now in baseball, we've done some work in the quiet eye. Basketball published a paper not too long ago with one of the NBA teams. The quiet eye really is a technique to gain the maximum information you need to be able to coordinate the motor action properly.
How does it work?
Yeah, in baseball, what happens is what are you looking at in the windup, for example? Because there's no way you can follow the ball all the way until it hits the bat. There are people that say they see the bat hit the ball. That may be the case, but they didn't watch the ball all the way through. They jumped ahead and kind of waited for the ball to catch up. Because we just can't move our eyes fast enough, especially when the ball gets closer to us, to really follow it. It just moves too fast for us, for the human being. So the important information comes from the first part of the pitch. And that information is not isolated just when the ball is moving. You get information actually prior to releasing the ball by the pitcher. And if your eye is pointed at the right spot, when that ball and the hand of the pitcher come across, you'll gain the right information. If you're looking somewhere else in the body of the pitcher, you won't get the information. You won't be able to move over and pick up the ball when it starts moving and so forth. And we see quite a bit of variation in batters' visual techniques, what they're looking at during the windup. And some of them more successful, some of them less successful. And if you compare the successful batters, you see kind of a pattern of what they look at during the windup, where they look at the pitcher and so forth. And it's not just one place. It's not just a release. It has to do with what you look at in the beginning of the windup, when you move your eye from that position to the release point, how long you keep your eye at the release point before you look a little bit at the movement of the ball. You really don't need to see much movement in order to pick up where to swing. In fact, the glasses I mentioned that we just got from a company in Holland actually are really cool because they're glasses you put on, and I can push a button and basically make the glasses opaque so the batter doesn't see anymore. You can even do it with an infrared beam, so when the pitcher's hand crosses that beam, the glasses go black basically. And that is a way we can force the batter to rely on that early visual information and rely on their speed of their bat and their ability to predict in the future where the ball is going to be when it crosses the plate, deciding to swing or not. Because if they watch it come closer, they won't have time then to swing, and everything will be late and they'll miss. It'll be a strike, complete strike. And so if we get the batters to kind of commit and make the decision and project in their mind where the ball is going to be early on by blocking their vision in training, that's a benefit.
It's kind of like practicing hard in order to make the actual contest feel easier.
The term is overload, and we use overload with the edge board. We use overload in all different aspects of training. Even in physical training, you use overload because if I can run a marathon in training, I should be able to run a 5K pretty good. and that's overload, right? You want to train yourself past what you really want to use, so you have a good reserve and you can really go all out on game day.
It's almost like that feeling of when you're running on a treadmill and then you get off and you feel like you're walking 100 miles per hour.
Yeah.
Now, how do you overload with reflection and using the edge?
Yeah, well, all of the I call them games, because it's really what they are. All of the games have the ability to increase in difficulty, for example. And we're still working out exactly what kind of the minimum or average level of ability on the edge is needed for batting performance, we'll say, in baseball. But what we like to do is try to get someone to go past that, to make it more difficult, to get them trained to the point where the more difficult task becomes easy, so that when they have to rely on their ability in the game, that's a piece of cake.
And we even released Reflection Plus, which allows athletes to, in some of our drills, hold themselves at a specific threshold of their best performance ever, so we can hold them in that zone where they're overloading, which I think is a really great way for people to train. And sometimes we'll even hear coaches say that during practice: go 90%, go 80%, go 100%. Whether that's something purely athletic like sprinting or some sports specific task. Now, I wanted to make sure we touch on different technologies that are out there, but before we do just that, how have you seen, since you were one of our first users, how have you seen Reflection evolve over the time that you've been aware of us?
Yeah, it's evolved quite a bit, and evolved in a way that I think is very positive. I think a couple key things. Number one, a lot of attention placed to making the hardware reliable. The form factor, the size of the device, how it sets up is pretty much the same as what we did before. There's some small changes, but pretty much the same. But the biggest piece is reliability. And I think the Reflection team is very proactive in identifying issues and trying to fix different issues, whether it's supply chain stuff or quality control coming from the actual physical manufacturer. So reliability is a big deal. In the beginning, I think the first day we started with the Edge, we went through 3 different Edge devices, if I remember, in Florida. Now pretty much we can have one device the whole spring and it works, which is a big positive. But more than that is the software piece. What's nice is that the guys, in your group, they're not vision guys. They're kind of looking at it from some scientists and statistical people, but they're looking at it from the side of what can we do, and that's actually the healthiest part. When you get people that are locked into one way of thinking, you get sidelined, you get corralled into doing the same thing all the time. When you have people that are willing to think outside the box a bit and come up with tasks and games that, this is interesting. I've seen them. They're interesting. I don't know exactly what is testing or how it's testing, but it's something that seems to relate to sports performance in terms of just the physiology of what you have to do. That to me opens up a new dimension in potential benefit. Now, is every one of these things going to be correlated to every single performance in sport? If it is, I'm shocked, because I highly doubt that. But I would expect, several of them to be connected, and different ones to be connected to different sports, because different sports have different visual motor needs. So those are really the 2 things: the commitment to perfecting the hardware, and the commitment to coming up with creative applications on the device that are somewhat based in what athletes do, but also based in other areas that may make sense. To me, is the kind of fresh air approach that we need in sports vision, as long as the next step in testing is performed and correlations are made and so forth.
Yeah, I think a really key part of technology development is making technology that fits into people's lives. And in the case of athletics, it's making games or drills for sports vision training that fit into an athlete's workout, so that they can superset it with strength training, or they can superset it with skill training. So it's it's great to hear that.
Yeah, it's not just and it's important to remember it's not just athletes. I did work with New York City taxi drivers a while back. There's a write-up in the New York Times about that. Taxi drivers need very much similar types of things. You may have heard some of them outside here today. They need similar types of things that athletes need to do. There's been a lot of work on London, taxi drivers, how they're learning how the streets of London affects their brain development. Parts of their brains are more developed than other people's in other people's professions. So military applications, the applications for this sort of technology, not just the reflection edge board, but sports vision in general, really applies to many other fields, many other pieces in everyone's daily life, even certainly not professional athletes, that can make a big difference. I give you a case in point. I have a patient that I take care of that has a congenital degenerative condition in their hearing and their retinas, and she basically loses her peripheral vision. And I wrote a paper about what we did with her. Mm-hmm. What we did was, she was finding that when she would, for example, cross the street, she couldn't see a bicycle or something coming from the side, and she got into a fair number of injured accidents. And so I can't restore the damaged retina, but what I can do is take the visual function she has and increase it, make it better, make her reaction time, for example, faster. So if she starts to see something a little bit, she can notice it and react to it, as opposed to needing more of it in her image to make the reaction, hopefully avoiding injury. We trained her, and we saw significant increases. She's very athletic in general, significant increases in her reaction time, speeds, and all the different things. And from what we haven't recorded how many injuries she's had, but anecdotally, she was much more comfortable crossing streets, much more comfortable in avoiding getting hit.
Just even in everyday life.
Everyday life, and everyday person. She's very athletic, but she's not a professional athlete by any means.
Right.
She's a psychologist, actually, and that makes a difference. So what we're talking about really is not just, and it really needs to be understood, it's not just athletes. Everything we're talking about, all the interventions we talk about, the abilities we're talking about, really should apply to everybody, because we can improve everybody's performance, everybody's safety, and their overall happiness.
Yeah, so that's really exciting to hear. I would say that reflection is in the light board category of sports vision training. What other general classes of technologies do you see that are important for folks to incorporate into their training?
Well, I think it's important to organize the different devices, interventions, tests into categories. One of the things that we've developed is a sports vision pyramid, where we look at, in terms of visual function, different levels of visual function. And the edge board, we'll get to in a minute, where it stands in that pyramid, but we start at the bottom of the pyramid with just basic visual ability of each eye, the ability to see different small size targets, the ability to see low contrast targets, and the ability to see targets that you only have a quick look at. Because as you know, in sports, you can't stare at the opponent and say, hold on, let me take a look, and then, okay, you can start again.
You don't have all day.
You don't have all day. It's rapid. Hitting a baseball, you have less than half a second. And so those are basic visual functions. So we measure that in each eye. The next level up is how your brain uses both eyes together, basically to measure 3D depth perception. And that's critical. It's critical, for example, if you're a boxer or you're a fencer, that's going to make a big difference. It's going to be less important if you're an archer. We published a paper about our experience with the U.S. Olympic team, with many different sports in the U.S. Olympic team, comparing their visual abilities, and we saw that boxers didn't have the sharpest vision, but they had one of the best depth perceptions, which is kind of what you'd expect. You have a large person in front of you, it doesn't have to be so sharp, but you better know how far away that right jab is, or you're going to meet it quickly.
Right.
And so that's the next level, depth perception. Then we look at decision making. Has the athlete or the individual use that visual information that they got from the lower levels to make a decision, really a go or no go, an action decision. Part of that also is a placement decision, planning out what a motor movement might be to intercept a served tennis ball, for example, or a thrown pitch. And finally, next level is coordinating a motor action based on that visual information, guided by the visual information to achieve that motor plan that you developed previously. The edge board is sitting kind of in that area there, in the decision making and in the motion, the motor task based on what you see.
And so then the other categories of, so the layers to the pyramid that you described, what general classes of technologies are available to train those different layers? Yeah,
remember, it's not just testing. It's not just training. Before training, one has to test. One wants to find out, is your ability less than normal? That's bad. is your ability kind of average? And do we think if we make your ability better, you'll do better than average? Those are two different things. One is a remediation, a correction type of thing, and one is a training looking for advanced ability. Now, we may have to train people that are weak in an area to get them up. But once they get up to the average, then we need to ask the question, now that you're where you should be and you're not being harmed, can we see improvement, right? And so those are two different things. So we want to think about testing and training. And there's some systems that are better at testing, and there's some systems that are better at training, and there's lots of systems that you can use both ways. Now, you never want to train somebody on the same system you test them on, because that's going to give you basically just learning how to use the device, not learning the skill better. You want to have varied training interventions that are all looking at the same ability that you're testing with a separate system. So we can use the edge board either for testing, as we do in spring training, or we can use it for training. I probably wouldn't want to test and train on the same system, and basically we use other systems to either test or train the task that we're looking for. So that's kind of one way of approaching it, one perspective. The other perspective is what kind of system you're using. Do you have a board in front of you? Are you doing it on an app? Are you training on a device that is placed at different positions and you're kind of in the sport training versus training sort of away from actually performing the sport, but a task that's important to the sport? So there's really lots of different ways you can cut and dice, this testing training question. And it's not just what hardware you're using, it's really how you're using the hardware, what you're hoping to gain from the hardware that makes a difference.
Do you see, I think right now the space of sports vision training technology is somewhat fragmented. There are different providers at all these different tiers. Do you see a future in which they'll be integrated? Or do you think it's best that there remains some separation between these different systems?
I like the separation. I like the competition. In fact, competition usually creates the best product for the consumer. And so I wouldn't want it all in one. We've seen companies like Nike that have tried to create this one-size-fits-all type of system. And that really takes out, from the sports vision specialist's ability to pick and choose the right thing for the right athlete in the right sport. I've often encountered teams that have been offered for sale systems to use, and this will do all your vision testing, and that's it. Well, that's the same systems used on all different sports, and the results really, frankly, aren't even often verified, consistent, or even correlated to performance, as we spoke about. And that, I think, takes it away. You wouldn't want to go to a doctor, again, I'll go back to the health picture. You wouldn't want to go to a doctor that simply does the same tests and the same thing on every person that walks in the door, regardless of their complaint. That doesn't sound like you're going to get the best answer for you. What you do want to go to is a specialist who understands what you're telling them, understands how that relates to what you're trying to do, and they can pick out of a toolbox, if you will, the different tests that are needed to understand the problem, and then pick out of another toolbox the interventions to correct the problem. That, to me, sounds like the more efficient and the more proper way to take care of athletes, as opposed to having a one-size-fits-all system that everybody uses the same.
So how do you make sense of it all then? You're here taking data from Reflexion, taking data from other systems, and somehow putting it all together in a way that does make sense.
Well, you can see it's not easy. I've lost all my hair because of that. And Greg Applebaum's lost most of his hair as well. The people I think that look at this seriously have a daily, hourly challenge to try to understand which of those systems fits in which toolbox and how we can use that in specific scenarios. We rely on other people's research, and that's one of the motivations for the paper that we wrote, is to try to understand other people's research to see if it's valid or flawed or what we can learn from it. We try to be creative. I try to read in many areas outside of sports vision literature. In fact, most of my reading is outside of the vision literature. It's in other scientific categories and literatures that we can try to leverage into sports vision and try to use these devices in certain ways that are consistent with maybe some other neurologic different disease methods or different athletic training methods to try to leverage what they've learned there with the visual information together for optimal performance. So it's an ongoing struggle, but it's a struggle that makes it exciting. That's really what makes motivates me to get up in the morning and do this work, because what I saw 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago is very different than what we're doing today. And I can almost guarantee you that what we do in 5 years from now will be different than what I'm doing today. But hopefully it will be better based on my experience, knowledge, reading, knowledge of other people, contributions of other people to the specialty.
No, I mean, not everyone's Dan Laby, right? So if they're not, and I know you're working on educating more and more people about sports vision as well, how do they make sense of it? What are some what's some advice that you can offer for those who are getting started?
Medicine, sports vision is no different than medicine in general. There are doctors that basically just practice what they learned, and there was a big movement to have continuing education to require people to continually learn and be tested, because everyone recognizes that things aren't the same 20 years ago that you learned in med school as they are today. And so sports vision is the same. So there are specialists that kind of just do the practice and do what other people say. And there are many other people that, hopefully like myself, that try to push the boundary to understand what's going on, to come up with innovative new things, and maybe create that framework for the others to use. And I think that's going to be true of any specialty. It's going to be true of sports vision. So if you're starting out in sports vision, you certainly need to know the basics. You need to know the history of what's happened, what these devices do. But I would urge you not to stay focused just on the vision part of it, the sports vision part of it, to make sure you understand as much as you can about every other field. And that could be from computing. You need to have a good background in statistics. I wish I had much better background in statistics, because I could leverage that much more to my advantage. So learn about statistics, learn about computers, learn about artificial intelligence, about virtual reality systems, how they work, the pluses, the minuses, the visual pluses and minuses, the motor, the cognitive differences. Learn as much as you can about psychology, about decision making, about how the brain works. Keep reading the basic science about visual pathways, what they found. Just not too long ago, there was a paper that published that I mentioned on my YouTube channel about the potential benefit of blinking. That when you blink for a short time after the blink, your visual system is actually more attuned, more alert than it is prior to that. And so obviously if you close your eyes at a critical point, you're in trouble. But maybe we can do a quick blink before that critical time to maximize the awareness, the ability of the retina to actually process. Last week, I read a paper about a new cell that they found in the retina, that they're still working on exactly what it does. We thought we had understood everything about how the retina was organized, the retina being the part of the eye that translates light into a signal. We thought we had a pretty good understanding how that was connected to the vision part of our brain back here. And all of a sudden, there's a new cell that does something different in there. Though, I'm not sure how that new cell is going to help me tomorrow take care of my athletes, but I want to know about those things so I can kind of keep an eye on that, because down the road, if there's a way we can, for example, use electrical stimulation on the scalp to stimulate better function of that cell, maybe we have a benefit, an edge somewhere, an opening to do better. And so if you're starting out, you have to have a very open mind. You have to be curious about everything, inquisitive, and you'll have the best chance to gather the knowledge, the information that you need to help your athletes the best.
That's fascinating how there's so much room to be open-minded, and really, even though it's a scientific process, really there's a lot of room for creativity here.
Science starts with hypotheses, right? It starts with a guess by a researcher about, I think maybe this is going to happen based on what I've seen so far. Obviously, it has to be tested to become a theory, to become something that's really true. But that process is what's exciting about all this. And that's kind of what motivates me. I would, one of the things that maybe moved me away from just taking care of patients in general was the fact that it becomes very cookbook. It's great to take care of a child and get their eyes to be straight, get them to see well, and it's a lot of fun interaction. I still do it. I love doing that. But in terms of being able to come up with new things, there's certainly new things, but it's not quite as wide open. Sports vision being a relatively new specialty, there's really many avenues you can take to explore, understand, and create new tests and new interventions, new training methods, like the edge board that can have an impact.
And even taking that a step further for us, our mission is making what we've called neuro-training kind of the roundup of these visual and cognitive skills, in making that mainstream at all levels of athletics. So we started with the edge and we introduced the flex so that folks could train at home as well. And recently we introduced with Under Armour the Train Your Mind app at underarmour.reflection.us, and we look to improve on that in the future. What's your thought of around apps in the space?
Mm-hmm.
Are they as beneficial as dedicated hardware that sort of meets the fitness equipment expectation in sports training? Where do they fit in?
Well, I think things are evolving in that, and I'm not going to say one is better than the other, but recently the idea of apps really has blossomed. The whole, our recent experience with staying at home, not going to the office, and doing Zoom calls and so forth is a whole new paradigm in business that may or may not pan out to be a positive. It may not be. It may be good in some areas, not in others. The ability to have apps and have athletes tested, remotely, opens up the ability to work with athletes, not necessarily in New York City, but now anywhere on the planet. I recently completed a project with Trent Alexander-Arnold of Liverpool Football Club in the UK. I made 2 trips to Liverpool to test and to retest him, but in between that, we did all of our work remotely through Zoom calls and through remote training. And he demonstrated an incredible improvement in many areas. And he's actually just about a week or 2 ago mentioned in one of the Liverpool papers about how that training has allowed him to be much more comfortable with his vision and rely more on his vision, allowing him to make these incredible crosses and passes and assists to win games for Liverpool this season. And so a lot of the work now we realize can be done remotely. We don't actually have to be face-to-face with the athlete. That opens up, many more athletes to get the training across the planet. It also opens up the ability to interact with people that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And so I like very much the idea of having an app on a mobile device. We already moved some of our vision testing into a mobile app that we've been using with baseball, Major League Baseball, for the last year or so since the pandemic started. I've been using it for other sports. I have a hockey player in Scandinavia that we've been doing it with. And there are other companies that have software apps that are now available in that way as well. So having the edge board or reflection system showing up in a mobile app is a wonderful addition. And I would urge other manufacturers to move in that direction as well. Again, proving the science, proving that it's reliable. Obviously, if we have someone using one device and someone using a different device and we're having very different results, that's going to be much harder to understand what's going on in terms of performance. But if we can keep it consistent, keep it with technology that's improving, and the phones nowadays could fly you to the moon easily compared to the lunar module that landed in 1969. So the ability of the hardware is improved so much, the screen resolution has improved so much, that these mobile apps really, I think, might be the wave of the future without the need for physical devices that have to be transported.
And at the very least, they're complementary. Of course, there are still technical limitations, and things like peripheral vision are a little bit more challenging, even in virtual and augmented environments, to fully engage because of limitations on field of view and processing speeds inside of those technologies that display content to the user, of course.
But some of it really depends on the sport, right? If you're a baseball batter, you don't need a wide field of view. If you're playing tennis, you don't need a wide field of view. It's a limited space. Certainly, if you're a basketball player, a hockey player, a soccer player, that's going to be a different story. So, again, as we talked about, I think the importance of understanding what's needed for each sport and not a one-size-fits-all whitewash becomes really important. So maybe there's an edge system that is physical designed that you need to have the wider field of view for certain sports, but other sports, it's really a matter of getting that reaction time down. And how fast someone can react to what they see. And you don't need the field of view for that. And that's what's important for X, Y, and Z sports. And so I think it doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all type of approach. It needs to be a tailored approach to what is needed for each sport.
Really what we should be considering is what is the easiest way to get the training that a specific athlete needs to them.
Yeah, the testing and the training to them in the most reliable, consistent, scientifically validated way. That's going to be the bottom line. Just like we'd expect, as I mentioned before, a pill from your doctor. It needs to go through many stages of human research, of animal research, human research. That has to be approved by the FDA before it's really provided for this disease. And that should be the same thing in sports vision. There's absolutely no reason why the medical specialty of sports vision should be any different than cardiology, endocrinology, neurology, and so forth. And if people are thinking about it more in the sports training realm, where you get a coach who has success and you want to go to them, first of all, that's a big bias. That's a halo bias, and there isn't maybe a lot of science behind that, and that means it's not necessarily going to repeat. It may repeat, but it won't repeat maybe because you like the guy, not because he trained you better.
Sure.
And so again, the science backing is critical. The specificity of the sport is critical, and the willingness, I think, of all the corporations, companies that are involved in sports vision, hopefully to think about it in that way, will allow a large toolbox for me to use in caring for athletes.
And we've seen even more folks really on the sports training side who might not be experts in sports vision training at all. Where do they get started, or how do they offer that to their athletes? Should they? What's your recommendation?
Well, we had talked, we've talked about in the field of some sort of certification process. So there can be some public, just like medical licensure. You can't just finish medical school, in fact, and say I want to practice. You have to be licensed. Not to mention, it's not easy to finish medical school. You have to have the degree for that. But some sort of certification process, so the interested athlete can understand that this person actually has accomplished a certain amount of background, accreditation, and so forth. Now, does that mean they're going to be the best cardiac surgeon compared to another person? It depends on many factors. But at least you know that if it's a cardiac surgeon, they have accomplished a certain level of proficiency to maintain their certification that encourage you to feel that they're probably a better choice than somebody who maybe went to some other place and isn't accredited and is saying they're a good cardiac surgeon. Unfortunately, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of advertising in a lot of these things. And for anybody who understands, advertising is nice because maybe you learn about things, but you can't completely swallow the lemonade or the Kool-Aid.
Right. But it would at least be a way to tell who's proficient and who's not.
Yeah, people right now without that certification look at their success, past success. And again, that's a halo effect, or what's called hindsight bias. Those are all things that are well known that will influence people to think this is better than that, when in fact that's not the case. And so if you're an athlete and you have a certain number of hours a day that you can do things, you want to pick the things that you're pretty confident are going to make a difference. You don't want to pick the things that just look good because of an advertising campaign or because someone had success with another athlete, a friend of theirs. That's great for the friend. They had success. I don't know the reason they had success. There could be many different factors. And for you to do the exact same thing doesn't mean you're going to have the same success.
It's just that sort of thinking is just simply anecdotal.
Totally anecdotal. Totally, has some value, but in terms of the scale of how valuable it is, we're towards the bottom there. When we're looking at, again, these randomized clinical trials that are set up so that it's blinded, so no one knows what they're getting, and you find the difference between two things, now we're pretty high on the scale of this is probably actually the difference, and you can expect this effect if you do this. That's the sort of thing I would want if I'm an athlete trying to base my career on. I want to take that as opposed to this very weak evidence down below.
And while there's not a gold standard certification, where should those people go for education?
Well, I'll start from the other side. What should athletes do when they're trying to find somebody to work with? Because there's certainly plenty of people that will tell you they're going to be able to do this and this for you. Well, there's a few things. Number one, experience, right? If someone is not very good, they're probably not going to be able to stay in the field very long because they won't have any business, right? So experience is a big thing. Number two is their background, their education, their training. Somebody who has very minimal training, read it off of an online course, may be different than somebody who's published many academic papers that have been reviewed by many other people and either sent back and rejected or actually felt to be worthwhile to publish and published. Those are your two main things. The other thing is looking at who does this person work with. If the person works with organizations that you think are pretty critical about allowing their athletes to work with this person, then you can be somewhat confident that they've been vetted by others in the field. And so if you really want to have the best chance to get the most from your testing and training, you find somebody like that. Now, if you're on the other side and you're a sports vision specialist and you want to get into the field, you have to understand that you're not going to be, Elon Musk on day one. It takes, if you read, the history, the autobiography, biography of Elon Musk, you see that he went through many iterations of lots of different things, from early on where he's just computer programming a game for, I think, PC Magazine or one of those magazines, to working in the PayPal area, to moving into the cars. And the first Tesla cars and the cars, the electric cars, were not very useful, not very successful. It took a long time to develop that. And so if you want a sports vision specialist to help you, or if you want to learn to be a sports vision specialist, you have to understand that there's a process of failure, some success, investment, and so forth before you actually get to the point of going to a professional team and saying, I'm here to make you win the championship. Because that's probably a big step that is not going to be supported very much. So you need to start out. Now, 30 years ago when I started, we started with a professional team because no one was doing this at all. Mm-hmm. But nowadays, it's much more crowded field. There's many more people interested in sports vision. A lot of the schools have sports vision, at least courses, electives, and so forth. And so people are learning about it. People are interested in it. People understand the value of it. And so you really need to kind of build up your credentials, build up your reputation, your CV, with good, solid, data points. And each of those data points then will grow bigger and bigger to have professional teams, to have elite athletes, and so forth.
What technologies should those people adopt?
Well, the technology is going to be based on what your understanding of sports vision is. And so, as I mentioned, this pyramid, from my perspective, the pyramid is a really nice paradigm to understand what different levels interact with each other, and how, if you can't see very well on the very bottom of the pyramid, it doesn't matter if you're really fast reaction time. If you can't see what to react to, it's worthless. And so to build that up, so you need to pick systems in each of those levels, if you will, to try to identify, the skill needed for the sport and testing it. I spent time looking at sports. I have a couple of books about all different sports, writing down the different visual abilities that are needed for different sports, so that I can figure out, well, I need this for this sport, and I need that for that sport, and so forth. And there are tools that I don't use in some sports, and there are tools I use in other sports.
So if somebody was trying to integrate reflection into, let's say we have a team, mm-hmm. maybe it's a baseball team, some other sports team, and they're working to integrate reflection into their athlete training, what tips would you have for them in that case?
Yeah, the understanding, first have the understanding of where the edge board reflections fits into the paradigm. You have to understand the different tasks and games that are within the edge board, which ones are going to be more critical or less critical. Some of them might be testing games, some of them might be training games, and you sort of have to plan out. And this is what I do before I work with a team, is I look at the team, look at the sport. I try to understand the team. When I worked with Trent in Liverpool, I spent a while looking at video of Trent, trying to understand what he does, where his weaknesses might be. If it's a team, there's obviously more people involved. To try to understand what tools I can bring to bear, what's going to be the most efficient way to measure. And is it going to be, for example, something like a blaze pod, which is a small disc or a fit light that lights up, that I'll need, for example, in a soccer or European football, where a foot-eye reaction time is important. Currently, for the edge board, I really can't have people use their feet on the edge board. So, if I'm working in that area, I'm going to be more interested in a test that's going to be able to give me that. As opposed to if I'm working for baseball, for example, where hand-eye coordination is critical, the edge board fits that beautifully, and that's what we've been using for several years. And so you really have to plan out what's needed, what the sport needs, and then pick the best tool.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, it's been a pleasure having you on the pod. For people who would like to follow along and learn more from you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so one of the things I've recently been trying to do in the last few months is try to create information that athletes can use without having to read scientific papers that I've written. And that's through my YouTube channel. If you just go on YouTube and look for Sports Vision by Dr. Laby, you'll come to the channel, and we put up 2 videos each week. We put a short 1-minute video and a longer 5 or 6 minute video each week, trying to explain about all the different pieces of sports vision, the different tests, the way the tests work, different training methods, different biases, all the kind of things we talked about here in short snips that are pretty digestible for the non-medical folks. and hopefully help the athletes perform better. You can look at my website, sportsvision.nyc, and that website has some videos, has a TED Talk I gave at Fenway Park. It has a Today Show segment that was done about me, a bunch of newspaper things, certainly scientific papers are in there, and that might be fun as well.
Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. Dan, of course, is one of the best in the field of sports vision training. We're glad you were able to join us today here in New York, and continue to follow along next time.
Thanks.